Commander Varric Stormheart stood motionless on the observation deck of the battleship Eternal Vigil, watching another alien fleet disintegrate under his tactical precision. The vacuum of space claimed their burning husks without ceremony, just as it had claimed thousands before them. His pale blue eyes reflected the distant explosions like frozen mirrors, betraying nothing of the calculations that had orchestrated this slaughter. 47 years of war had carved humanity's greatest military mind from the ice of necessity. The hegemony wars against the Seven Species Alliance had demanded perfection, and Varric had delivered it with the cold efficiency of a glacier reshaping continents. His strategies were studied in military academies across human space. His tactical innovations had saved billions of lives. Yet standing here, surrounded by the debris of his latest victory, he felt as empty as the void itself. "Sir," came the voice of his aide, Lieutenant Corvin. "The enemy flagship is attempting to surrender. They're broadcasting on all frequencies." Varric's fingers tapped against the railing, a rare display of what others might mistake for impatience. It was merely his mind processing variables: enemy ship capabilities, crew complement, intelligence value, resource allocation for prisoners. The surrender meant nothing to him beyond logistical considerations. "Standard protocol," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Accept their surrender, secure the ship, and extract all tactical data. Schedule debriefing. 408:00. The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, their message. It's not just military surrender. They're begging. They say they have families, children aboard civilian vessels in the outer system." For a microsecond, something flickered behind Varric's eyes, too brief to be called emotion, too fleeting to be hope. It died before it could take root. "Irrelevant. Our mission parameters are clear. Eliminate all hostile forces in this sector. Execute the order." As the Eternal Vigil's weapon systems charged for another devastating barrage, Varric turned away from the carnage. Each victory felt more hollow than the last. Each strategic triumph another step deeper into the ice that had formed around his soul. The war had made him into humanity's perfect weapon, calculating, relentless, utterly without mercy. But weapons weren't meant to feel, and feelings were a luxury that got soldiers killed. The ship's corridors echoed with his footsteps as he walked toward his quarters. Junior officers pressed themselves against the walls as he passed, offering crisp salutes that he acknowledged with barely perceptible nods. They feared him, respected him, but none dared approach him as anything more than their commander. Varric preferred it that way. Emotional connections were tactical vulnerabilities, and he had systematically eliminated every weakness from his life in his private quarters. Spartan and sterile as a medical bay, he reviewed casualty reports and fleet dispositions with the same detached precision he applied to everything else. Zero human losses in today's engagement. Minimal ammunition expenditure. Maximum enemy casualties. By every metric that mattered, it had been a flawless operation. So, why did victory taste like ash in his mouth? The answer came as it always did, pushed down, buried beneath layers of tactical analysis and strategic planning. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new enemies to destroy, new victories to claim in humanity's name, and he would face them all, with the same frozen perfection that had made him legend. He had no way of knowing that fate was already positioning the one force in the universe capable of melting the ice around his heart, and that she would arrive wearing the face of his enemy. 3 days after the massacre at Kepler 442, Varric stood in the Eternal Vigil's war room studying stellar cartography when his world shifted on its axis. The prisoner transport had arrived from the captured alien flagship, and among the defeated officers was someone who would challenge everything he thought he knew about warfare, about enemies, and about himself. Dr. Lirelei Dawnweaver entered the interrogation chamber with her wrists bound, but her spirit unbroken. She moved with the fluid grace of her people, the Zephyrian Collective. her opalescent skin shifting through subtle hues of amber and rose as her emotions played across her features. Unlike the other prisoners who had cowered or raged, she regarded Varric with curious, intelligent eyes, the color of distant nebulae. "Commander Stormheart," she said, her voice carrying musical harmonics that seemed to resonate in frequencies human ears weren't designed to perceive. "Your reputation precedes you. Though I confess, the stories failed to mention how young you are to carry such weight." Varric's training kicked in psychological profiling, threat assessment, interrogation techniques. But something about her direct gaze threw off his calculations. "Your fleet violated the Terran defense perimeter. Under the Articles of War, you were legitimate military targets. We were carrying medical supplies to refugee colonies," Lirelei replied, settling into the interrogation chair with unsettling composure. "My people have been trying to establish humanitarian corridors for months." "Did your intelligence reports mention that, Commander?" They hadn't. Varric's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Military intelligence indicates Zephyrian ships have been staging attacks from refugee sectors. Your people use civilian populations as shields." For the first time, emotion flickered across Lirelei's features, not anger, but something deeper. Sadness. "Is that what you tell yourself when you vaporize hospital ships? That we're all secretly warriors, hiding behind innocence?" "Ideal and facts, not propaganda," Varric said, but even as he spoke, he felt something crack in his certainty. During the engagement, there had been ships with unusual configurations, too lightly armed for military vessels, too heavily shielded for pure civilian craft. Medical ships would need heavy shielding to protect patients during transit. Lirelei leaned forward, her bonds clinking softly. "Commander, my people have a saying, the ice that never melts becomes brittle. You've spent so long freezing your heart that you've forgotten how to see clearly. When did you last question an intelligence report? When did you last wonder if the enemy you're destroying might have families, dreams, reasons for fighting that go beyond conquest?" Varric stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the deck. "This interrogation is concluded. You'll be transferred to the prisoner holding facility pending exchange negotiations." But as he reached the door, her voice stopped him. "I was a combat surgeon before the war, Commander. I've seen what warfare does to both sides. Your people aren't monsters, and neither are mine. We're all just trying to survive a conflict that's grown too large for anyone to remember why it started." Varric's hand paused on the door controls. In 47 years of war, no enemy had ever spoken to him about survival. They had cursed him, threatened him, tried to bargain with him, but none had ever suggested that they were fundamentally similar. It was a dangerous thought, the kind that could undermine the clarity of purpose that made him effective. "Guards," he called, and 2 Marines entered to escort the prisoner away. But as Lirelei passed him, she whispered something in her native tongue that his universal translator rendered as, "Even the deepest winter must yield to spring." That night, for the first time in decades, Commander Varric Stormheart found himself unable to sleep. The intelligence reports arrived at 0347 hours, delivered by a haggard communications officer who'd been trying to verify the data for hours. Varric received them in his quarters, expecting routine updates on fleet movements and supply lines. Instead, he found himself staring at evidence that would reshape everything he thought. He knew about the war. Lirelei had been telling the truth. 63% of the Zephyrian vessels his forces had engaged over the past 18 months had been carrying medical supplies, refugee evacuees, or humanitarian aid. The intelligence reports he'd been receiving had been systematically edited, stripped of context that might have given him pause. Someone in the chain of command had been feeding him sanitized information, turning humanitarian missions into military targets. Varric's hands trembled, the first time his body had betrayed emotion in over a decade. He reviewed the data twice, then 3 times, running probability analyses and cross-referencing with battle reports. The mathematics were inescapable. He had been orchestrating massacres, not military victories, at 0600. He made his way to the detention level. The corridors felt different now, as if the ship itself had shifted around him. Guards snapped to attention as he passed, but their salutes felt like accusations. How many of them knew? How many had been following orders to eliminate civilians, while believing they were fighting enemy combatants? Lee Relay sat in her cell, reading from a handheld device medical journals, he realized, as he approached. She looked up as his footsteps echoed in the corridor, and her expression shifted from wariness to something approaching concern. "Commander," she said, rising to face him through the energy barrier. "You look troubled." Varric stood silent for a long moment, his reflection ghostly in the barrier's shimmer. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "The intelligence reports, they were incomplete." Lee Relay set down her reader, her features cycling through hues of deep purple. What he'd learned was her people's expression of empathy. "You've seen the truth. How does it feel, Commander?" "I don't. I can't." Varric's legendary composure cracked, revealing the man beneath the military machine. "I've spent my entire adult life protecting humanity. Every decision, every strategy, every battle, it was all to keep our species safe. But if I've been killing innocents, then you've been used," Lee Relay said gently. "Just as my people have been used, just as countless others have been used. The question is, what do you do with that knowledge?" Varric slammed his palm against the wall beside her cell, the impact echoing through the detention bay. "I should have known. It's my responsibility to verify intelligence, to understand the battlefield completely. How could I have been so blind? Because someone made sure." "You would be," Lee Relay replied. "Commander, in my culture, we believe that true strength comes not from never falling, but from how we rise after we've been broken. You were shaped into a weapon, but you're still a man. You can choose what to do with that weapon." For the first time in his career, Varric felt the ice around his heart beginning to crack. The sensation was terrifying, like losing a limb he'd relied on for survival. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Something that might have been hope. "My people," he said quietly. "They're counting on me to win this war, and mine are counting on me to end it," Lee Relay said. "Perhaps that's not as different as we thought." Varric met her gaze through the barrier, seeing not an enemy, but a fellow soldier carrying impossible burdens. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Lee Relay's skin shifted to warm golds and soft blues, colors of dawn, of new beginnings. "I would remember that the greatest victories are often the ones that prevent the need for future battles. I would ask myself, what would it take to stop this war before it destroys us all?" As Varric walked back through the corridors of his ship, he carried with him a question that would change everything. What if the enemy's greatest weapon wasn't superior tactics or advanced technology, but simply the courage to see their opponents as people worth understanding? The ice was beginning to melt, and with it, everything he thought he knew about winning. Varric stood before the sealed conference room aboard the Eternal Vigil, knowing that what transpired in the next hour would determine not just his career, but the fate of billions. He had called together his senior staff under the pretense of tactical review, but his true purpose was far more dangerous. He intended to confront them with the truth about their recent victories. Admiral Krex Ironbound, the weathered veteran who served as Varric's direct superior, dominated the head of the table, his cybernetic eye word, as it focused on the holographic displays showing their recent campaign statistics. Around him sat the other architects of humanity's war machine intelligence officers, tactical specialists, and logistics coordinators, who had transformed the defense of Earth into a campaign of systematic extermination. "Outstanding work on the Kepler 442 operation," Ironbound began, his voice carrying the satisfied growl of a predator reviewing successful hunts. Intelligence reports confirm we've eliminated another major Zephyrian staging area. Their refugee movements have dropped by 30% in this sector. Refugee movements, Varric repeated, the words heavy with new meaning. Admiral, I've been reviewing our intelligence protocols. There seem to be ... discrepancies. The room fell silent. Intelligence Director Vex Shadowmere leaned forward, her augmented eyes narrowing. What kind of discrepancies, Commander? Varric activated his personal display, projecting the raw intelligence data he'd uncovered. These are the unfiltered reports from our reconnaissance drones. 63% of the vessels we've engaged in the past 18 months were carrying medical supplies, civilian evacuees, or humanitarian aid. Our processed intelligence reports classified them all as military targets. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Admiral Ironbound's human eye never wavered from Varric's face. Commander, processed intelligence exists for a reason. Raw data can be misleading, contaminated by enemy disinformation. Our analysts filter out propaganda to give you actionable intelligence. Propaganda? Varric's voice carried a edge that made his staff shift uncomfortably. Medical supplies for plague victims are propaganda. Evacuation ships carrying children are enemy disinformation. Director Shadowmere's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Commander Stormheart, you're beginning to sound like you sympathize with the enemy. I trust your conversation with the Zephyrian prisoner hasn't compromised your judgment. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. Varric had expected this, the implication that compassion equaled treason, that questioning orders meant betraying humanity. It was the same logic that had allowed them to wage war without conscience for nearly 5 decades. My judgment, Varric said carefully, is that we cannot win a war by becoming the monsters our enemies claim we are. If we're systematically targeting civilian populations, we're doing what's necessary to survive. Ironbound's fist crashed down on the table. The Hegemony Alliance has been trying to wipe humanity from the galaxy for 47 years. Every ship we destroy, every base we eliminate, every world we scorch is one less weapon pointed at Earth. You, of all people, should understand that, Commander. Varric felt the weight of those years pressing down on him every battle, every victory. Every night he'd slept soundly, knowing he'd defended his species. But now that certainty crumbled like ice under spring sun. What if they're not trying to wipe us out? What if they're just trying to survive, same as us? The room erupted. Voices rose in anger, in disbelief, in accusations of treason. But Admiral Ironbound raised a hand, and silence fell like a curtain. Commander, he said, his voice deadly calm, you're relieved of duty, pending psychological evaluation. Report to Medical Bay for immediate assessment. Security will escort you. 2 Marines stepped forward, hands moving to their sidearms. Varric looked around the table at faces he'd known for years, people he'd fought beside, planned with, trusted with humanity's future. Now they watched him with the cold eyes of strangers. You're making a mistake, he said as the guards flanked him. All of you. This war doesn't end with more killing. It ends when we remember that our enemies are people too. As the conference room door sealed behind him, Varric realized that his journey from ice to warmth would cost him everything he'd built his life around. But for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive. The real battle was about to begin. The medical bay of the Eternal Vigil had been transformed into a prison of sterile light and humming machinery. Dr. Nex, Mindforge, the fleet's chief psychological evaluator, circled Varric like a carrion bird studying fresh prey. Banks of monitors displayed brain scans, stress indicators, and neural pathway analyses that would determine whether humanity's greatest military mind had finally cracked under the weight of endless war. 47 years of combat operations, Dr. Mindforge mused, his cybernetically enhanced voice carrying no warmth. It's remarkable you've maintained functionality this long. Most commanders experience complete psychological breakdown by year 20. The human mind simply isn't designed to process that much death. Varric sat strapped to the examination chair, electrodes mapping every firing neuron in his skull. Through the medical bay's viewport, he could see the detention level where Lirelei remained imprisoned. The irony wasn't lost on him. Both of them were now prisoners aboard his own ship. My psychological profile has been stable for 15 years, Varric said, his voice steady, despite the chaos raging in his mind. This isn't breakdown, it's awakening. Awakening. Dr. Mindforge made a note on his tablet. Interesting choice of words. Tell me, Commander, when did you first begin experiencing empathy toward enemy combatants? The question struck like a physical blow. Varric realized he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It had been a gradual thaw, like ice melting under persistent spring warmth. But he could identify the catalyst. Lirelei's voice, speaking of survival, of families, of the possibility that enemies might be people worth understanding. Empathy isn't a disease, Varric said. It's what separates us from machines. In your case, Commander, it may be what separates you from command. Dr. Mindforge's augmented eyes glowed as he accessed Varric's files. Your neural patterns show significant deviation from baseline. Increased activity in regions associated with emotional processing. Decreased function in areas linked to tactical decision-making. You're becoming ... human. The word hung between them like an accusation. Becoming human. As if his decades of perfect military service had somehow made him less than human. As if the ice around his heart had been a feature, not a flaw. A soft chime indicated an incoming message. Dr. Mindforge frowned as he read his tablet. Curious. It seems your Zephyrian prisoner has requested to speak with you. She claims to have information vital to ending the war. Varric's pulse quickened, though he kept his expression neutral. What kind of information? That's classified. Above your current clearance level, I'm afraid. Dr. Mindforge's smile was as cold as vacuum. Admiral Ironbound has assumed tactical command. He's planning to use the prisoner as bait, broadcast her location, and wait for a Zephyrian rescue attempt. We'll destroy their fleet and extract intelligence about their command structure. The plan was tactically sound, brutally efficient, and utterly without mercy. It was exactly the kind of strategy Varric would have approved 2 weeks ago. Now, the thought of using Lirelei as bait made his blood run cold. She's a non-combatant, Varric said, a medical officer. Using her as bait violates the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions were written for wars between humans, Dr. Mind replied. They don't apply to xeno-conflicts. Besides, effective intelligence gathering requires a certain flexibility in moral parameters. Varric tested his restraints, feeling the bioplastic bonds that held him to the examination chair. Through the viewport, he could see increased security around the detention level. Soon, Lirelei would be moved to a more secure location, one designed to facilitate her use as bait. The thought of her facing death because of his people's machinations ignited something fierce in his chest. Doctor, he said quietly, you're right about one thing. I am becoming human. The question is, what have the rest of you become? Dr. Mike paused in his note-taking, his augmented features reflecting confusion. I'm sorry. We've spent so long fighting monsters that we've become monsters ourselves. We've forgotten that the point of war isn't to destroy everything different from us. It's to preserve what makes us worth preserving in the first place. Fascinating, Dr. Mindforge murmured, making rapid notes. Complete ideological inversion. Classic stress-induced psychological breakdown with messianic delusions. I'll recommend immediate neural restructuring to restore your tactical effectiveness. Neural restructuring. The clinical term for erasing inconvenient memories, emotions, and moral qualms. They would turn him back into the perfect weapon, the frozen sentinel who could order the deaths of innocents without hesitation. The thought terrified him more than any enemy fleet. Outside the viewport, Varric saw guards moving toward the detention level. Soon they would come for Lirelei. Soon, she would pay the price for teaching him to feel again, unless he found a way to stop them. The explosion came at 2,347 hours. Ship time. Varric had been counting the minutes since Dr. Mindforge left him alone with the monitoring equipment, waiting for his opportunity. The blast shook the eternal vigil from bow to stern. Emergency lighting, bathing the medical bay in crimson as alarms shrieked their warnings. In the chaos, Varric activated the miniature plasma cutter he'd palmed from the surgical tray, a tool meant for delicate operations, now repurposed for his escape. The bioplastic restraints parted like paper under the focused beam. Varric rolled from the examination chair as the ship's automated systems announced hull breaches in sections 7 through 12. Through the viewport, he could see the detention level and chaos guards running toward emergency stations. Security barriers flickering as power fluctuated throughout the ship. He'd triggered the explosion himself, overloading the medical bays. Primary power coupling through the monitoring equipment, still attached to his skull. It was a desperate gambit that could have killed him, but desperation had been his only ally, since Admiral Ironbound relieved him of command. The corridor outside Medical Bay hummed with activity as damage control teams rushed to contain the crisis. Varric moved through the chaos like a ghost, his decades of experience allowing him to navigate the ship's emergency protocols better than most of the crew. He'd helped design these systems, after all, never imagining he'd one day use them against his own people. The detention level was a maze of conflicting priorities. Half the guards had been reassigned to damage control, while the others struggled to maintain security protocols during the emergency. Varric found Lirelei's cell through the smoke and sparking conduits, her silhouette visible through the flickering energy barrier. "Commander?" Her voice carried surprise and concern as he approached. "What's happening?" "We're leaving," Varric said, his plasma cutter making short work of the cell's control panel. The barrier dissolved in a shower of sparks. "Admiral Ironbound plans to use you as bait. They're going to broadcast your location and wait for your people to attempt a rescue." Lirelei's features cycled through rapid color changes, shock, anger, then grim determination. "How many ships will they sacrifice trying to save me?" "As many as it takes." Varric helped her to her feet, noting the grace with which she moved despite her confinement. "Your people care about their own. Ironbound is counting on that. And you're betraying your own people to save me," Lirelei observed, her eyes studying his face in the emergency lighting. "Why?" Varric paused, the question cutting to the heart of everything he'd discovered about himself in the past few days. "Because I finally understand what we're really fighting for. Not just survival, but the right to remain human while we survive." They moved through the ship's maintenance corridors, following routes Varric had memorized during construction briefings decades ago. Behind them, he could hear search teams beginning their hunt. His betrayal would be discovered soon enough, and when it was, he would become the most wanted fugitive in human space. "Where are we going?" Lirelei asked as they climbed through a service shaft toward the shuttle bay. "Neutral space," Varric replied. "There's a diplomatic station at the Meridian Junction. If we can reach it, we might be able to establish communication with both our governments." "You're talking about ending the war?" Lirelei said, wonder coloring her voice. "After 47 years, you're talking about peace." "I'm talking about survival," Varric corrected. "For both our species. This war has already lasted too long, cost too much. If we don't find another way forward, it's going to destroy us all." They reached the shuttle bay as the first security teams arrived at the detention level. Varric could hear the commotion over the ship's communication system, angry voices, barked orders, the sound of his own career imploding in real time. But for the first time in decades, he felt no regret about the path he'd chosen. The shuttle. Meridian's hope was a small courier vessel, built for speed rather than comfort. As Varric powered up the engines, Lirelei settled into the co-pilot's seat, her hands dancing over the navigation controls with surprising familiarity. Medical ships carry the same basic systems, she explained, noting his surprise. I've flown evacuation missions before. The shuttle bay doors opened to reveal the star-scattered void beyond. Somewhere in that darkness lay the neutral zone, and beyond that, the possibility of a future where children from both their species might grow up without learning to kill each other, Commander Lirelei said, as they cleared the Eternal Vigil's docking bay. What made you change? What melted the ice around your heart? Varric considered the question as they accelerated toward the jump point. Behind them, he could see the lights of pursuit vessels beginning to follow his own people, hunting him like the traitor they believed him to be. You did, he said simply. You showed me that the enemy had a face, a voice, a reason for fighting that went beyond conquest. You reminded me that strength without compassion isn't strength at all, it's just destruction wearing a uniform. As the Meridian's hope engaged its jump drive and leaped toward the neutral zone, Varric felt the last of the ice around his heart finally melt away. What remained was warmer, more fragile, but infinitely more human. The war that had defined his life was ending, but the peace he hoped to build would require everything he'd learned about both fighting and feeling. Behind them, the darkness of space gave way to the light of distant stars. G1, a sun that might someday shine on worlds where former enemies worked together to build something better than the ashes of their old hatreds. 3 years after the Meridian Accords were signed, Varric Stormheart stood in the observation dome of New Geneva Station, watching Zephyrian and human children play together in the station's central garden. Their laughter echoed through the transparent aluminum walls, a sound he'd never imagined possible during the long years of war. Lirelei approached from behind, her footsteps soft on the polished deck. She carried a datapad containing the morning's reports from the joint reconstruction efforts, former battlefields being transformed into agricultural colonies, weapons factories retooled to build hospitals and schools. The Kepler 442 memorial is finished, she said, settling beside him at the observation rail. Both our people's names carved together, enemy and ally, united in remembrance. Varric nodded, his reflection ghostly in the dome's curved surface. The memorial honored all who had died in the war, regardless of species or allegiance. It had been his idea, and the political opposition had been fierce from both sides. But some wounds required acknowledgement before they could heal. Any word from Earth? Lirelei asked. Admiral Ironbound has been relieved of command. The new administration is committed to the peace process. Varric's voice carried no satisfaction at his former commander's downfall, only the quiet sadness of a man who had seen too much hatred justified in the name of necessary evil. Below them, a human child helped a young Zephyrian who had fallen, while playing. The simple act of kindness spoke louder than any treaty or diplomatic protocol. This was what they were really building, a future where such gestures were natural, expected, unremarkable. Do you ever regret it? Lirelei asked. Giving up everything you'd built your life around? Varric considered the question, watching the children's games continue in the garden below. He had lost his military career, his reputation, his place in human society. He had been branded a traitor by some, a hero by others, but mostly he had been forgotten, which suited him fine. I regret the years I spent as ice, he said finally. I regret every life I took without understanding why they were fighting. I regret that it took me so long to learn that strength means knowing when not to use it. Lirelei's hand found her opalescent skin warm against his weathered fingers. And what do you not regret? Varric smiled, an expression that came more easily now, after years of practice. I don't regret learning to feel again. I don't regret choosing hope over hatred. And I don't regret meeting an enemy who taught me that the most important battles are the ones we fight against the worst parts of ourselves. In the garden below, The children had formed a circle, their games evolving into something resembling a dance. Human and Zephyrian moved together with the unconscious harmony of those who had never known they were supposed to be enemies. Varric squeezed Liralay's hand gently, feeling the warmth that had first begun to melt the ice around his heart. The war was over, but their real work was just beginning. The harder task of building a peace that would last, of raising a generation that would see former enemies as simply friends they hadn't met yet. Outside the dome, the stars shone with the same cold light they had during the darkest days of the war. But inside, surrounded by the laughter of playing children and the warmth of hard-won wisdom, Varric Stormheart had finally found his way home. The Ice Age was over. Spring had come, at last end.